Setup of a multifunction device. In this procedure, we'll configure the internet connection for our D-Link router, we'll manually configure its IP settings, and we'll enable and configure the DHCP server that's built into the router so it can hand out IP addresses to the clients. Here's a little diagram of what I want to accomplish. This is the router, and as with most routers, it gets two IP addresses. The first is the WAN IP, which is provided by the internet service provider in this case. So I don't really have to do anything. As long as I configure the router properly, it'll automatically obtain that WAN IP from the ISP. And they're out in the cloud. They've got their DHCP server out there somewhere. Not too worried about that. On the LAN side, though, I'm going to assign an IP address to the router. Now, by default, the router uses 192.168.0.1, but of course, I have to be different, so I'm going to use a Class B private IP. The network is 172.29, and so the address I'm going to use is 172.29.250.1. The laptop I'm working on now, I'm going to assign statically, and we're going to assign the .2 IP address to this guy. The other laptop we use will automatically get its IP address from the router once I set up a DHCP scope. And finally, the 2003 domain controller that we have, normally servers should be set up statically, so I'm going to set that up statically as .200. And finally, we're going to set up that DHCP scope on the router, and that's going to hand out addresses between .100 and .110. So when this laptop gets on the network, it should get the first one in the range. It should be 172.29.250.100. First thing I need to do is connect to my router. I'm going to use a browser to do so, and I'll type in the IP address of the router, the default 192.168.0.1. Now to do so, I previously configured a 192.168.0 IP address on my laptop. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to connect to that guy. So a little quick tip there. We're going to log in, and here we have the Internet Connection Setup Wizard. You all know how I feel about wizards. It's great for learning, so if you want to use it, that's great. But usually you can get what you want done quicker by using the manual option. So we're going to select Manual Internet Connection Setup, and that's going to bring up some settings that we need to modify. First, internet connection. The most common is dynamic IP, meaning that you're getting your IP address from the ISP automatically, and you need do nothing. As long as you set up the router properly, it'll automatically go out and get that IP address. However, in some cases, you may want to use a static IP. If you are hosting services of some sort, then you want to use a static IP. If that's the case, then you would select static IP, and you'd have to type in the IP address, subnet mask, gateway, and DNS server information that your ISP provides to you. Make sure you type it in exactly. And you have other options here. You have the options if you're using DSL or a secure connection. But again, we're going to use DHCP, the standard. We're going to obtain our IP address from the ISP. Host name is usually optional, but I'm going to type one in just in case I want to use this with my internal DNS later, and we'll call it D-Link. We're going to leave Use Unicasting checkmarked. We may need that in the future. DNS servers. I could add my DNS server that I'm running on the LAN here, but I'm not going to do that just yet. And as far as DNS information for the internet, that info is going to flow through the router to the clients automatically. I don't have to configure this section. MTU we're going to leave as 1500. Now in some cases you can modify the MTU to get a better performance on your internet connection. We're going to leave that the same. And finally, MAC address. This is the WAN side MAC address, the wide area side, and this is important. If you were connecting to the internet directly with your computer, you're probably going to have to clone that computer's MAC address and use that as your WAN MAC address. And that's okay. You may say, well, I thought you can't have the same MAC address on the network. It really isn't on the same network. It's on the WAN side. whereas your PC's MAC address is on the LAN side. So it's okay to do this. And most ISPs need you to do this. They want to see the same MAC address. Now take it to the next level. I currently have a Belkin router as my internet connection. And that guy is using a MAC address that was cloned from a PC long ago, an older PC that I don't use anymore. So the problem here is I need to use that MAC address because that's what the ISP is looking for. So what I could do is I can go and connect to my other router, the router that's currently functional, which is 172.30.250.1. And I have a connection to that network as well right now. And we look at the MAC address for this. And you look down here at WAN MAC address. That's the guy that we want to use. So I can't really clone it automatically by clicking on the button. I have to write this down and then bring it over to the other router. So if you're switching from one router to another, you may be able to connect it and connect automatically, but quite often the ISP will require that you use the same MAC address, otherwise they're not going to want to talk to you. You might be able to call them, but you're going to have to wait on hold or whatever. Better just to use the old MAC address. So I'm going to type that in now, and every octet that you type must be separated by colons. So 006008 C0 09 8D. And that's what we want. Now we're done with our configuration, and we'll just save those settings. And it's going to tell us that we have to reboot. So I'm going to reboot that, and I'll be back in just a moment. Okay, the router is restarted, and I'm just going to log in once again. Now we're going to go to Network Settings. And here is where we're going to modify the LAN settings for the router. Now you see the default D-Link address of 192.168.0.1. Once again, to be different, I'm changing this to 172.29.250.1 according to our documentation. So I'm going to Class B private network. The subnet mask that's here is a default Class C, so we need to change that as well to a default Class B. Next is local domain name. Now the local domain name would be the domain that I'm using internally, and I am using one called dpro.com. However, I don't want to add that just yet. I'll be adding that in subsequent labs, not only the domain name, but the DNS information that we saw previously when we did the manual internet connection setup. So I'm going to leave that blank for now, and we're going to leave Enable DNS Relay checkmarked. What that's going to do is it's going to have the router relay any DNS information from the ISP to the clients. So the clients will get their DNS server address information through the router, but really coming from the ISP. So there's our IP information. And down here is our DHCP server. We do want to have a DHCP server, so I'm going to enable that by check marking it. And we're going to set the range. Now this has an automatic range if the router was set up to 192.168.0.1, which is fine. It's just that everybody uses that, so I want to try to be a little dynamic, so to speak. So we're going to add the range here, 172.29.250.100, and that's going to go through to 172.29.250.110. Lease time, by default, it's 1440 minutes. We're going to leave that as the default and leave the broadcast on. NetBIOS announcement is not necessary at this point, and we don't need to learn any NetBIOS from anywhere else, nor is any scope needed. So we're going to leave all this NetBIOS information as is. Win servers. I don't have any Win servers on the network, but I will later. You might not see Wins that much, but you still might see it when dealing with specific networks that have specific appliances that need Wins. So this will actually be set up later on, this whole section, along with the DNS and the domain controller information. We can also add DHCP reservations if we wish. And if you wanted to have a reservation between 100 and 110, we could add that computer, what its IP address is going to be, and its MAC address. But instead, I'm just using IP addresses that are outside of the range. Now, if I use the whole range of IPs between, say, .0, .1 through .255, .254 for this Class B range, then I'd have to start using those reservations. But because I'm just using .100 through .110, I can just use .2 for this laptop statically, and I don't have to worry about adding reservations. But of course, you could do that, and when you add a reservation, it remembers the IP and the corresponding MAC, and it reserves that information forever. So just in case it gets a little confusing in the future, you could use that. So we've got the information set up. I'm going to save the settings in just a moment. But when I do so, I'm going to lose my connection because I'm changing the IP network of the router. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save those settings. Then I'm going to change the settings on the laptop side and then reconnect to the router. So we'll save that now. It's going to have to reboot now. Okay. Now I'm going to go to my LAN card on my laptop, go to Properties, and we're going to make those modifications to the IP. Right now I'm on the 192.168.0 network. I'm going to get rid of that, and we'll put in the information according to our documentation, which is .2, double 255 for the subnet mask, and the gateway. The gateway address is always on the same network as your IP address, and the gateway is actually going to be the router, so 172.29.250.1. We'll click OK and close. That automatically connected me to my server. Okay. And we'll get back to the browser here. Again, I'm on the laptop and I'm at the browser. And what I want to do is I want to reconnect to the D-Link router, but with its new IP address. So 172.29.250.1. And we're good. We'll log in. And everything looks good to me. So we have the router set up for an internet connection. We have the router set up with its LAN IP information, and I've set up the laptop statically for now to connect to that router on the same network. Now, as I showed here, I want my server to have a static IP address of .200. So I'm going to need to configure that now. I'm going to connect remotely to the server. Right now the server's on the 10 network, and I just happen to have another IP address bound to my laptop on the 10 network, so I can connect to that server coincidentally. So I'm connected to the server, but I want to modify the server's IP so that it can have a connection to the router. So we're going to go to the LAN connection, and we'll go to Properties, modify the IP address, and we'll set this guy to the address that we had in the documentation, 172.29.250.200. We need the correct subnet mask, Class B, double 255, and the gateway is going to be the router, 172.29.250.1. Now, preferred DNS in this case for the server is going to be itself because it's running DNS. It is a domain controller as well. So I need to type in that address 172.29.250.200. Now, when I click OK, it's going to try to bind this information. I'm going to lose my connection to the server. That's okay. It should be all right. I could always reconnect later because my laptop is on the 172 network as well. So we'll click OK for that. We'll click Close. And I'm going to minimize that guy and let him bind that information. And so now we have the 2003 domain controller set up as .200, and he now has a connection to the router. Virtual servers and port forwarding. The server I have on my LAN is not only a domain controller and a DNS server, I've also installed the FTP service and the World Wide Web publishing service. You see, I want people on the internet or out in the cloud to be able to get to my server so they can access my FTP files or access the pages on my web server or my secure web server. But to do so, they're going to have to flow through the router and to the server. To accomplish this, we set up what's known as port forwarding on the router. What this will do is it'll allow the people on the internet to connect to the router, and they'll normally connect to an IP address and a port number. That'll be the WAN IP address and port number of the router on the WAN side. But the router will redirect that to the IP address of my server internally and the port that each service is using. So let's set that up now. We're back in the D-Link router. We're going to click on the advanced link, and you're going to see a lot of options here. The one we want is the first one that comes up, which is virtual server. I'll click the checkbox, and we'll name each service that we want to redirect to one at a time. So the first one is FTP. Then I need to type in the IP address of the server, which is 172.29.250.200. I'll select the application name. It is FTP, File Transfer Protocol. And then we have to put in the ports. Well, we've got the public port and the private port. The public port is the WAN side port of the router that people on the internet will connect to. The private port is the internal port number used by the server on the LAN side. They can't see that. The people on the internet have no idea what that is. So that's why we need this port redirection to be involved here. Normally that port number would be 21 for each of these. That's the default. However, your ISP may not allow access to port 21. They may block that port internally so that they can save on bandwidth, basically. Or you may want to have a secure connection that not just anybody knows of, because everybody knows that FTP is port 21. So you may have to modify what that port is, and you can select something else. For example, 5711. Just make sure that the port you're using isn't utilized by a common application. Now, the only problem with this is you'd have to tell every user on the internet what that port number is. And of course, you'd have to tell them what the IP address is on the WAN side of your router as well. I'm just going to leave it as the default as 21 for now. Now, I also want to set up a web server, so we'll call that www. And again, we'll put in the IP address 172.29.250.200. Application name is HTTP. And by default, the port would be 80 on both ends. So you might also see 8080 or some other port numbers. Once again, you could use whatever public port number you want. Just remember you'd have to inform the users on the internet what that is. And finally, I also want a secure service. So that's going to be HTTPS. And again, same IP address for the server. We'll click in the application name, HTTPS, and by default, as you remember, that's going to be 443. There we go. We've got 3 virtual servers. In reality, it's all leading to the same computer. We could have different services running on different computers on the LAN and make these different port redirections if we want. And what we're going to do is we're going to save those settings. No reboot is necessary, and that information will become permanent. Now, if you wanted to turn off that redirection temporarily, you could just deselect the check marks and save those settings. Now, we also have the option for port forwarding. Now, what we just showed is a simple version of port forwarding, but this configuration gives you the option to have multiple ports open or a range of ports to a particular IP address. Now, you may want to use this if you're using some type of internet relay chat or P2P networks or BitTorrents, BitTorrents like uTorrent, something like that, where you have to use a range of ports or multiple individual ports. So that's where you would do that. But we're going to leave the virtual server as is. And now what I want to make sure is that my services are indeed running on the server. I installed the services, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're running. Who knows? Maybe I turned them off at some point. So I'm going to make a remote desktop connection to the server. Can't use the 10 IP address anymore because we're not using that network. Now it's 172.29.250.200, and we'll connect. Log in, and I'm going to go to my MMC, and we're going to take a look at the list of services that we have running. Okay, here's the list. Here is FTP, and as you can see, it's not started right now, so I'm going to double click that guy, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start the service, and then I'm going to set it to automatic so that every time I restart the server, the service restarts as well. Click OK. Now we see it's set to automatic and it's started. Same thing for HTTP SSL. And the same thing for HTTP, which is known as the World Wide Web Publishing Service. Faster, faster. Okay, so all three of those are started. And if we wanted to further prove that, we could go to the command line and run a netstat-an. And of course, we're going to get a boatload of information here. But if we scroll back to the top, we'll see, okay, 21 is open and 80 is open. Good stuff. FTP and HTTP are running. Now, there's a lot of other things that you may want to keep in mind with this. Rules that your ISP may have set up, your firewall, things of this nature. You also may want to take a look into DIN DNS or dynamic DNS, and that's found in the tools section of this particular router. DIN DNS allows you to get around the whole problem of dynamically assigned IPs. You may say, okay, well, Dave, I gave the people out on the internet, I gave them the IP address of my router and the port they want to connect to, but what if the IP address changes? Then they won't be able to connect anymore. Well, that's when you enable dynamic DNS, and you have to sign up for a dynamic DNS service, a DIN DNS service, with some provider. Here they give you an option for D-Link, DDNS, or dindns.org or .com. There's a lot of places you can do this. What they'll do is they'll give you a name within their domain, and you'll get a host name on there and usually a password or some type of key. They will monitor your connection, and they will know if your IP address has changed, and they'll create that redirect automatically for you. So instead of giving your users out on the internet an IP address, instead you'll give them the name, which could be something like dprouse.dlinkddns.com or something of that nature. So look into dynamic DNS if you're having the dynamic IP woes. And again, there are a lot of other options in here, and I don't want to make changes to this, so that's okay. I don't need to save that. But there's a lot of other options here. Network filters, access control. We're going to get into this a little bit more once we get the wireless network set up and once we get into the security section. But one thing I wanted to look into is QoS. Quality of service, or QoS, is something that you want to try to utilize if your router supports it. It enables what's known as traffic shaping, and the QoS engine can prioritize types of applications that you use. Let's say that you go out onto the internet and the most common thing you do is you go to internet websites or you browse. Well, chances are you don't have to make any modifications to this because browsing is a very common application to use. But let's say that you were a hardcore gamer, or you went to other specific types of news sites or something like that, or you want your BitTorrent client to have a higher priority. You could add those applications here and then put in the IP address of your local computer or computers and the remote computers that you normally connect to or computers and the ports that they use. And then you can assign a priority number between 1 and 255 to those guys. So if you're really into gaming or you're really into your news transfers or your BitTorrent client, you may want to incorporate QoS and give a higher priority to those applications than to others. And that would also prioritize that for every computer on the LAN. So a little QoS, or quality of service. To summarize, in this lab we showed how to set up a common multifunction device, we showed how to configure the network settings in a multifunction device, and demonstrated how to set up a DHCP server, and enabled various networking functions in the router like the virtual server functionality. Up next is Lab 10, Wireless Communications.